conference. And if you could put your name in the chat, that would be great. And again, mute yourself until the end. We will have questions. So let me explain to you a little bit or introduce you to the fabulous Jane Baxter Lynn. And I'm going to be very transparent with you that I was sent to Jane at a time when it was particularly difficult in my organization. I was having some big problems with my staff primarily, and my staff went to my board, and then my board got very alarmed about everything that was going on. And I learned so much about myself from Jane, and so much about how some of the things that are my strengths get turned around into weaknesses if I play into them too heavy, and how to temper some of my passion for just, the subject and our lovely field of book access, and my drive, my personality, just driving personality, and just kind of curious, relentless change person, and understanding how that was negatively affecting my team and what I had to do as a leader to kind of change that around. Now, have I mastered this? I would not say, well, I don't know.
Pretty much.
I now have many.
How many years is it now?
9. I'm 9.
There you go. Right, how many years ago was that?
Gosh, I guess it was 5. Was it 5, Jane? I feel like it was around 5 years ago. But COVID, it's hard to think. It might have been 6. It might have been 6. Yeah, it might have been 6. It might have been like 3 years into the
I think you must have mastered something.
Yeah, well, at least I have a lot better tools now in order to try to pay attention to the organizational culture. And I think a lot of times when we first become leaders, we think, oh, it's all about my vision and I have to boss people around, particularly we women who maybe didn't have a lot of power before we came into a leadership role, or and that flexing those power muscles can sometimes really not create the results that's good for us or for our organization, and putting our organization first. And Jane, I just think, has a whole bunch of tools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, and we'll all have a discussion about organizational culture. So save your questions for the end. We hope we have a lot of time there for questions at the end.
I'll do my very best to keep it succinct as possible. However, this is a very big subject, and so I've tried to get it down to the 45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have that 10 or so minutes for discussion. In the meantime, Emily had mentioned that if you have a burning question, just stick it in the chat, because first of all, someone else might have an answer for it, and second of all, we can always address it at the end. So go ahead and do that if you would. One of the reasons I was so excited to be invited to do this with you today is because I am passionate about organizational culture. If you don't understand organizational culture and how essential it is to your mission and so forth, you're going to have a ongoing challenge. So what I want is to introduce you to what is a thriving organizational culture that is mission-focused, people-centered, and sustainable over the long term. So in our title, we said we were looking at best practices for building organizational culture. Caveat, I do want to say that these are what I've seen over the last 15 years. I've obviously learned from a lot of other people as well. But it's only some of what we can talk about in terms of best practices for building. And don't forget that not only are we building, but we're also maintaining. And a lot of people forget that when they start to do this type of thing. They forget that the building's all very well, but then what? And that's where capital campaigns will often have an issue. They build it and they forget that they're going to have to maintain it. So my hope is that in this discussion, it'll assist you in creating or enhancing a supportive positive and enduring culture that increases the impact and sustainability of your book access organization. You may have other thoughts that I may not mention, and what I'm truly hoping is that this will be the first of many conversations that you have on this topic, so that you can actually share your own best practices and ask your important questions. So as we go through, some of my suggestions will be presented within the context discussion, and then at the end, I'll suggest some others to focus on as you move forward. However, first, I would like to know who you are a little bit more. Emily, can we have our first poll? Can you just quickly take this poll? It should take you 2 seconds. Can you all see the poll? Can somebody just unmute themselves and let me know if you can actually see the poll?
Yes, I think we could all see it.
Okay,
I
thank
took
We've
it
got
already.
15 out of 17 people,
right.
and I think give you one more.
I can't
Oh,
see it.
you can't see it?
No, unless I'm doing something wrong. Didn't pop up on my screen.
Who's speaking there?
Sarah.
Sorry.
I don't know why I can't see it, but I can't.
Gosh, I don't know why.
That's okay.
So, sorry, you can answer my question. Have you taken a leadership class?
No, I have not.
Okay, thank you. And are you in a leadership position now? Barry?
Oh, I'm sorry. We are an all volunteer organization, so everybody sort of has a leadership role.
Exactly. Kudos for identifying that. Thank you. Okay, so
Can
have you
people see
taken
the
a lead?
results of the poll right now?
I can. I
Okay,
hope
good.
everybody else can too. So 60% of you said that you've taken a leadership class and 40% say you haven't. And that doesn't mean you have to. It just helps me understand where you might be in this. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a second. And then, are you in a leadership position? I was hoping, and I have seen, that most of you said yes, because often one thinks that the leadership position is the ED or the CEO, but that's not the case. There are many, many leaders in an organization. And I'll talk to you a little bit about executive leadership teams and so forth. So thank you for that answer. So some of what I share, you may already know, or it may be new to you. You might not think of yourselves as leaders per se, but 87% of you do. So that's awesome. However, everyone on this call is a leader. So I'm going to be talking to you on that assumption. You're in a position to create change. You're in a position to influence change. Is everything okay?
Yep. keep
Anyway,
going.
either way, sometimes it's helpful to have it laid out in a methodical way. So what I'm going to do, sorry, there you go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what is organizational culture anyway, and why is it important. I'm going to talk about who's responsible, excuse me, because I get asked that question all the time. I'm going to give you some context for this conversation, looking particularly at organizational life cycles. I don't know what's happened to my throat, so you're going to have me suck a longer. And also alignment. And then I'm going to give you some ideas and best practices for building and maintaining a positive organizational culture. So what is organizational culture anyway? And if we had a chance, I would love to hear your views on that, but we don't have time for that. So the word and the concept of culture is hugely diverse. Many of us think of culture with a big C as being about place, social characteristics, and norms. However, more generally, it encompasses values, you have them, beliefs, system of language. How are we communicating? Communication itself and the practices that people share in common. And that is what is used to define a group as a collective. So all that is rather blah, blah. I'm going to get more into more functional detail. So in today's context, we're talking about specifically about organizational culture. So we're not talking about all these other cultures. We're talking specifically about organizational culture. And in my view, an organizational culture puts employees first. In other words, they're people-centered. If your employees feel that they were treated with respect, now, let me say, because I was just thinking about Sari, you are all not paid employees. But when I'm talking about employees, I can also be talking about volunteer leadership. So just bear that in mind as we go, that I'm not just making the assumption that it's only applicable to employees. However, if you treat people with respect in a non-judgment environment, they are most likely to be satisfied, productive, contribute positively, work well as a team, and understand the importance of collaboration. Now, for those of you who've been in the nonprofit field, you know that all those things are absolutely essential to any kind of success, given the challenges that we have. In a nutshell, building a positive workplace culture entails implementing, and this is again, not what people think of, implementing organizational practices and policies that encourage that respect, reduce judgment, enable equity and inclusivity, and also generate trust and empathy and a sense of belonging. Now, all that sounds all very well, but it is about providing people with guidelines. They want to be heard. They want to know what their function is and how it fits. And they're empowered to innovate, collaborate, and grow. And again, I'm sorry if all these words are there, but it's so important to fully understand that actually it sounds complicated, but it isn't. It's what you, given that you're in the nonprofit field and so dedicated from a book access perspective, it is what you're all about. So actually creating a positive organizational culture is not complicated. In fact, it's fairly basic. The key is to recognize the need. That's step one. Recognize that we actually should have one, and then intentionally make a plan to incorporate it into all aspects of your organization's way of operating. And I'm not saying it's easy. No one is. It does require some work up front, but the key is to be intentional. And I'll talk some more about intention as we go by. So I'm often asked who's responsible for setting organizational culture. And most people ask me that question, and then they ask me, how can non-leadership staff, could be your volunteer board, or contribute or even influence its development? So let me answer the first part. In the first instance, organizational culture needs to be led by the CEO or the ED, depending on which one you use. I'm going to use ED all the way through, but it could be actually the chair if you're an all-volunteer board like Sari is. And if there is one, if you're lucky enough to be slightly bigger than a small one, if there is an executive leadership team, while at the same time intentionally working to ensure buy-in from your board and staff. So you're leading it as an ED, or one is leading it as an ED, maybe supported by an executive leadership team, and I'm going to mention that a little bit more in detail, and then working with your board and staff to ensure buy-in. That's pretty simple, isn't it? I hope. Culture should be based on your vision, mission, and values. And you'll understand why I say values as we go through. It also should be based on other strategic elements, which are part of your strategic plan. If you as a leader don't set the tone and guidelines, organizational culture will develop on its own. And that is not a good, more often than not, it is not a good thing to have. So you need to set the tone and the guidelines. Otherwise, it's going to set them themselves. And you may be following the horse. So to a large degree, building organizational culture is about servant leadership, with the key attributes of a leader or leaders who understand the importance of building a safe, enjoyable, and productive work environment for all its people. It is about leading by example. And one thing I hear over and over again is, my boss says we have to do this, but they don't do it. So it is not about leading by example by saying, do as I say, not as I do. Listening to what it is about, listening to what people say and inviting their input, engaging them where possible throughout any process that you're going through, so that they understand that they will be heard or why they're being asked to do something. Now, it doesn't mean that you always have to give them what they want. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So some of you are EDs, some of you are in other leadership roles. As I mentioned, I'm a great believer in executive leadership teams, and that doesn't make it fancy. All it does is take your senior folks who are department heads and take them out of their departments and make sure that they understand or develop what's good for the overall organization. The role of the LT is to be involved in making decisions for the whole organization, not simply for their departments. And just fairly recently, I've been lucky enough to be able to work with a number of nonprofits to build those ELTs, and what a difference it has made to the entire organization and to the ED. Together you drive the agency, structure, and the culture. On the second part of the question, which was how can non-leadership staff contribute or even influence the development of culture? The key here is that everyone learns how to present their thoughts and ideas in a way that is non-confrontational and provides positive solutions. The process needs to include an understanding by your team that even though they don't have formal authority in evolving a positive culture, they have the ability totally to influence and input to decisions. Their opinions are valid and valuable. Most importantly, they need to feel a part of the process. And I can hear some people saying, yeah, this sounds great, but what about that squeaky wheel? I'm going to come to the squeaky wheel on that. The key, as I mentioned, it also applies is to allow people to present their thoughts. What is also helpful is for EDs when they're working with their boards. I've often heard EDs say, I can't do that because it's a board decision. My answer is, yes, you can. Although the final decision may be the board's at the end of the day, you have the opportunity to totally influence, whether that's sourcing new board members or ensuring board members accept and buy into your people-centered approach. All of that comes down to relationship building and clear communication. So here's products to move on to some context. As you develop that culture and in other things that you do, it's always helpful to bear in mind 3 strategic leadership essentials. Leadership, which is at the top intentionally, strategy, and communication. Aligning these 3 elements should form the basis for everything that you do. And I know that Emily has tried to follow that, and I'm not sure if Jill has, but I know that Emily has definitely tried to follow that process where she's looking at those 3 things every time. My colleague Craig and I created this SLE model because we realized that an organization can't be sustainable without integrating these 3 areas intentionally. As I mentioned, building a sustainable positive culture depends on leadership by the CEO or the ED. And if there is one, the ELT, as I call it, they also need to work with the board and staff. So building a culture without a strategic direction, and I use the word strategic direction. Most people talk about strategic planning. I don't. I talk about strategic direction, which is your vision, mission, values, priority areas, and overarching goals and strategies. Why do I do that? Because for me, strategic planning is a tool in order to be able to set that direction. And so you often hear about strategic plans being left on the shelf. Nobody ever pays any attention to them and so forth. I think that's because it's a book and nobody takes it out. Whereas if you're talking about strategic direction, it influences everything that you do. So, so you've got the strategic direction, and then finally, effective communication, intentional communication strategies are fundamental. That includes marketing. It includes internal communications, external communications, and so forth. It's the overarching part of this puzzle. It's actually interesting that the fundamental is obvious, and yet so few people actually use this integrated approach. It's that disconnect that creates challenges for you, especially when it comes to decision making. You sat in a 2.5-hour meeting and motivating people to get work done and engage in your desired culture. So let's take a little closer look at these. I'm not going to do it in too much depth, but you all know what leadership is, right? The most important element of the three is leadership. As leaders of book access organizations, you set the tone and example to your team. One challenge we all have, especially in the small to medium-sized organizations, is that we often get tied up working on the details and don't make time to think and act more strategically. So one of the things that I have always found helpful, and I'm going to share with you now, is to give you a better understanding of your roles in these organizations. And Sari, sorry to keep picking on you, but you've got that full volunteer board. Others have got staff and a board and so forth. All these are relevant because if you don't understand the difference between leadership and management, you tend to get into the weeds because they all look the same. So let's do a quick poll, if we may. What is the difference between leadership and management? Do you know? Is there one? Yay, I love that. Yes, you are right. There is a huge difference. And a lot of people don't understand that they're different roles because so many of us have to do both. However, they need to be treated as separate roles. Yes, I do leadership. Yes, I do management, but they're not. They are intrinsically intertwined, and there's no absolute distinction between them, but they are significantly different. So I wanted to quickly run through what that might look like for smaller particularly, but book access organizations. Some of them, one of them focuses on the short term and the other focuses on the longer term goals. So having been an ED a few times where I literally did both, I know that I used to call myself the chief cook and bottle washer. So let's have a my computer keeps taking off the screen. Sorry, there you go. So this is leadership, visioning, amongst other things. Visioning, strategic, motivating, inspiring, persuading, and partnership building. That is the role of leadership. that is setting and leading the strategic direction and creating the relationships that are required to make this culture a wonderful place to be. On the other hand, managers typically run the business. They're involved in planning, operationalizing, administering, implementing, and staffing. And those of you who do both, you can recognize which is which. They rely on formal authority to make decisions that are required for organizational sustainability, and they are responsible for day-to-day functioning. Most of these are around administration, processes and policies, planning, staffing, and project management. A lot more focus is on project management right now, which is so exciting for me to see. Anyway, it's very much a question of managing up and down. Why does understanding this difference matter, especially when it comes to culture? The challenge is that the management aspects of a job can consume too much of your time, energy, and thoughts. So you don't commit enough time to actually leading strategically. The key is being intentional about making the time. And I've got in bold letters here, it is possible, believe me, with a little smiley face. I promise it is, and I'll come up with a few suggestions later. Through intentional decisions and managing your time, you can do both. And I am a perfect example of that. I was totally in this environment until one day, my boss at a nonprofit I was at an ED for, he came and he said to me, you are trying to do all things. You have to take one day a week that you dedicate to just thinking and getting more strategic stuff done, relationship building and so forth. No meetings at all. It was part of what they did in his architectural firm. And what was exciting for me for that was not only did I do that, but it taught me that I could actually manage my own calendar. I didn't have to say yes all the time. If somebody suggested a date, I could always go back with an alternative, or I could suggest some alternatives. And that was like the turning point for me, and hopefully for you all now that I'm telling you about it, is to actually take control of your calendar. I have a client right now who is not in control of his calendar because he allows other people just to put stuff in, and he's just in meetings from beginning of the day to the end of the day. So I would like you to learn that, and I'm going to come back to it later. All right, strategic direction. Talk very briefly about that. You need to know where you're going in order to be able to create a culture. Because if you don't know where you're going, you don't know what you need to do to get there. So how you can create a positive environment, working environment, I'm not sure, because nobody be clear on what they're doing or why they're doing. So the strategic direction is the path that you provide as a strategy screen. It allows for consensus. It allows for commitment and accountability at all levels. It lays out the what, the when, the how, and the why. And it encourages you to do more strategic thinking. But oftentimes we don't realize that we're not doing that at all. We're just getting the job done. Even though it does take precious time, by reviewing your organization's strategic direction, along with your board and staff if you have it, you have the opportunity to step back and reflect on whether what you're doing is actually in line with your desired outcomes for the organization. And very often, I once had a client where we did this exercise and they had 4 priority areas. None of what they were doing fitted into one of them. The other 3 had stuff in, but there was one priority area that had nothing in it. And so it really gives you a chance to say, wait a minute, first of all, should that be a priority area, or what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing and could be doing instead? It provides a strategy screen and a mindset too. So if somebody, I'm sure all of you have these wonderful, enthusiastic people who come with all these wonderful, enthusiastic ideas. And you don't know how to say no to them, because so you end up getting mission creep. And what you can do instead is just say, well, hold on a minute. Thank you for the lovely idea. However, can we just check the strategy screen and make sure that it fits within our strategic direction? And if it doesn't, you're in a position to sweetly and nicely say no. Thank you. However, I do hasten to add that a strategic plan should only be used as a guideline, because a lot of people, they have these fancy strategic plans done, and then one, it sits on the shelf, or people get so enamored with it that there's no flexibility at all. And the problem with that is that if things change, like COVID, for example, if things change, if they're trying to stick to this rigid strategic plan, they're going to end up in trouble, because they're not going to be able to move with the times. So a plan, as far as I'm concerned, and Emily and Jill have heard me say this many times, a plan is only a guideline, and it can be changed. If you don't have a plan, chaos can exist, or everybody ends up not knowing what on earth they're supposed to be doing. So, another context for you. No matter what size your organization is, small, medium, maturing, or large, or how long it's been around, recognizing and acknowledging where your organization is in this life cycle is one of the most valuable starting tools when having a strategic conversation and developing a positive culture. Since I started using this many years ago, it now becomes the basis for all my discussions. Where are you in this? So I'll briefly go through the stages, and then I'd like to do another poll. And I want you to think about, where do you think your organization is in this? So startups, obvious. I think you all know about startups because some of you are them. Basically, it's starting up. Its key things are passion and programs. And in the case of a new organization, building programs and ground level support is critical. And it involves a lot of work by the founding volunteers and board. Adolescence and growth. Once the programs are in place, and the next stage of growth requires an increase in infrastructure, perhaps a larger board, perhaps a different board, administrative staff, or an expanded volunteer base, as well as probably a more formal communications process. So once you get up to the mature sustain, you think, oh, great, I'm there, I've got it, I'm in control here. Now, that is one of the dangers of this mature sustain level. If you stay constantly aware that, yes, you've got it, you've found the way to do things, and never forget that things are changing beyond you, and adjust and adapt accordingly. If you don't do that, then you'll start to hedge into the decline. And also sticking to rigid strategic plans can do the same thing to you. It's key to adjust your organization to ensure continuity and relevance rather than continuing in the same old way. So obviously stagnant and decline is if your board and your executive team don't recognize the need to continually assess and adapt, you're going to begin to decline. Unless leadership steps up and develops a plan of action to change, the organization could end up closing. And it's happened so many times, sadly, even despite being a wonderful cause. If the decline is caught in time, which is where that dotted line is, the organization has an opportunity to refresh and renew, even though it can be a lot of work for the board and, if there is any, the staff in place at that time. This is when there's a real need to ensure inclusion of staff, volunteers, partners, and funders. Again, back to your culture. So let's do the poll. Where do you think your organization is in the life cycle? Interesting. Interesting. Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. So typically a nonprofit's programs are far superior to its other infrastructure components. So my request to you is that if you consider yourself, and 42% of you do, to be in the growth stage, please ask the question, do we have a strategy for growth? Because if you don't, you're going to implode. So do you have a strategy for growth? Please make a note of that as an action, a possible action after this meeting. Another consideration is your board. Do you have the right board? When you get to the mature, have those board members been around forever and ever and ever? And that's another whole conversation about term limit. But anyway, and they haven't noticed because they're just doing the same old thing. Is it time possibly to use term limits and to start bringing on people who can ensure that you either stay in the sustain area or you are able to renew and move on to the next chapter? So finally, oops. Finally, as far as the strategic leadership essentials are concerned, can you read the quote? The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. It is so true. That was George Bernard Shaw. Communications is the means to clearly and consistently define, market, and communicate your organization's purpose and culture. What's often forgotten that it's not about external only. It should start with internal. Is your board saying the same thing? I'm not talking about their stories. I'm talking about the underlying messaging. Is your staff aware of what the messaging is? And is everyone singing from the same song sheet? So it's essential that you get people involved in this whole communication, but it has to become intentional. You have to identify who your stakeholders are, decide who needs to be talked to, how you're going to reach them. One challenge that you have, Emily mentioned that some of you have a challenge with managing employees and volunteers who are rather strong-willed and not necessarily open to change. I have found that it often comes back to clarity of role, inadequate awareness of the organization's overall strategic direction and their role in that, and then do they actually fit with the values of your organization? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The same applies if you're dealing with an opinionated board member or other volunteers who believe they know best. Your role as the leader is to get them on your side and not allow them to be disruptive. Again, easier said than done, but it can be done. Once again, it comes back to communication. Don't let something fester. Prepare and discuss. So briefly, we've got 15 minutes left. I will very briefly look at where does culture fit within the overall organization as you are operating it. And this is such a great framework for you to be able to use. And I'd be willing to share it with Emily and have her send it out to you. It shows you that culture is at the top, okay? So on the left, you have your strategy. What are those overarching strategies? What are the critical tasks that have to be done in order to give book access to the people that you need to give book access to actually achieve your mission? Culture, that is where it is overarching over everything you do. And it also influences the type of people. What do the people need? Are you a people-centered organization? Are you hiring people who belong in that culture? Have you checked that they have the skills and so forth? But more importantly, are they aligned with your values? And then obviously there's the formal organization too. And I did very quickly have Seedling Foundation do this for me just to show you that it can be extremely helpful and it's not complicated. And when I asked the CD to do this, he came back to me and he said, you know, we're doing all this, but we're not intentionally referring to it all the time. It's just become part of the way we do business, which is good. However, you've always got new people coming, and if you don't remind them what the culture is and how it operates, then it's going to eventually erode. So, some ideas and best practices. In the next 10, oh, I wanted to give you 10 minutes questions, sorry. All right, I'm gonna have to just briefly go through some ideas, and I'm not gonna be able to give you the detail. It is on the actual PowerPoint, so I'm not sure how we could do that. But anyway, number one, as far as I'm concerned, is being intentional. If you had to choose one word, and I have, to live by, this would be it. Living intentionally can make life and leadership easier and clearer. I know it sounds cliche, but it is so true. If you don't think about it, you're not going to act accordingly. And so it has to become just a part of your persona. Listening to understand, not to respond. And I'm sure all of you have seen this quote many times. But where it comes to culture, however, where it comes to culture, this is crucial. So often bosses or leaders don't listen to people below them. They think they know better. Whereas if you're trying to create a people-centered culture, you have to take the time to listen to people's ideas, to people's concerns, and then understand it, not necessarily accept it, and then respond. So there's a whole bunch of ideas that I could have for you, give you for that, but please just remember, listen to understand if you're trying to create culture, then respond. And always look for a way that you make the person feel that you've listened to their suggestion and give them a reason why you cannot accept it, or maybe you can't accept it now, but you could later. I've got examples and so forth, but be clear in your communication. We talked about that just now. The main thing is be authentic. Authenticity is becoming such a desirable, important thing. Empathy too. It's a buzzword at the moment, but what people forget is empathy's always been there. It's been around. Yes, it's always been important. And however, as it's become more and more top of mind, there is a concern that you feel you have to say yes to be empathetic because you're people pleasing in a sense. But you don't have to say yes. You can say no. It's how you say no that matters, and offering solutions. Have a defined open door policy. I see this time and again. Oh, my staff have, you know, they can come to and talk to me about anything at any time. I have an open door policy. Yeah. First of all, you shouldn't have one in the full context, because when do you get any work done? If you don't have some guidelines as to what exactly does open door policy mean, what is your accessibility, then they're going to see that you constantly close the door because you're trying to get something done, rather than them going, oh, I know he's working on something, so it's okay. So have a defined open door policy. Manage burnout. Oops, what happened? I'm missing. One of them's gone missing. It should say manage burnout. Burnout's another huge thing in nonprofits, and there are so many ways of dealing with this, but the most important thing to remember is that cliche again of put your mask on first. Find ways to take an intentional step back, to be doing things differently, like forward planning. I have a lot of clients who go fly by the seat of their pants. Managing your time better, delegating, if so, to whom and can they take on more, be more consistent. Again, so many clients just don't have consistent meeting plans. It's not difficult. It just takes intentionality. And then perhaps hire a confidential nonprofit coach to help work through these things, because especially EDs, they don't have someone they can talk to. They can't take some of the stuff to the board. They can't take some of the stuff to their staff. So who do they talk to? Who do they ask the question? So having an executive coach or a confidential coach, as far as I'm concerned, advisor, is really to have a thought partner, to have someone you can brainstorm with and ask maybe silly questions. So when it comes to your team, again, back to intentional, notice that somebody might be burning out. They might be trying too hard. Are they taking on too much? They kept saying yes, or they're going silent, or you've seen an incredibly different change in behavior. Something's going on. And again, you as a leader need to pay attention, even though you're probably doing so much. All right, to move on. Embed proposal mindset into the way you will operate. I have will ask Emily to send you the link to a blog that I've written on this subject. I have found that if you can get your organization to get into a proposal mindset, what changes is 1, good use of time, 2, effective decision making, and 3, people actually know what the challenges are. So what often happens, and I'm sure you all have seen this, what often happens is I come to you and I say, we have a problem. This is the problem. What are you going to do about it? So by instilling this proposal mindset into your staff and into the way you too operate, they have to come to you with this suggested solution too. Doesn't have to be a brilliant solution, but they have to have thought through what are the implications of what they are saying is a problem. Because too often organizations have whiners or negative people who potentially undermine the system because they're always whining and they never give a solution. If you introduce this proposal mindset as a norm, it just becomes much easier to enforce. Obviously, building respect and trust. A lot of people think that I should trust you or I should respect you because you're my boss or I'm your boss or whatever it may be. That is not true. You have to earn, and I use that in a sort of light term, you have to earn respect. And that is part of being a servant leader. That is part of wanting this people-centered culture. You have to show them that you walk the talk. You have to say, if I'm going to see you, I'm going to get you an answer to this by Friday. You're going to come back to them on Friday and say, I don't have an answer yet, but I just wanted to bring you up to date. Those sort of things that can become just normal, take 2 seconds. And as you go, they will learn to trust that you mean what you say, and they will respect you for it. And then last but not least, celebrate. Celebrating, again, I've seen so little celebrating going on, except in my clients, of course, because people forget. They get into, we're doing this, we've got this, so they don't take the time to celebrate. And you've got to celebrate regularly, genuinely, and possibly take into account how people want to be recognized. And that can vary. It's not just, oh, let's have a party. There are some people who actually don't like going to parties. They don't want to be singled out. So taking that into account is, again, very important. Oh, okay, slip to the bottom. Okay, I'm going to ask Emily to put a question into the chat, which is, You're lost. Can you read it out, Emily? Oh, there it is. Sorry. A final question for you today before we open up for questions. Based on this overview of positive organizational culture, drop one thing into the chat you think your organization needs to change now as you work towards a people-centered culture. Go. Yes. Learn how to celebrate better in a virtual environment. It is very different. And there are fun but not invasive ways of doing that. I like that. Yes, perspective process. Nice. Give you another minute or so. Thank you for that input. So we have like 5 minutes. Sorry, it isn't 10. Any questions?
Jane, Jill, we had one question that was asked earlier on. Could you repeat the piece you said about managing strong-willed volunteers and or employees? Something about the
Sure.
clarity of role and what else
Sure.
helps managing strong-willed, passionate people.
Gotta find it. Sorry.
There were 3 points that you said, and I couldn't get them all down quickly enough.
Sorry about that. If I can't find it now, I'll certainly.
Yeah.
Oh, it's
people-
okay. I can
no,
go back
I've
and
got
watch.
it. I've got it. I've got it. I've got it. Okay, so generally it comes back to clarity of roles, the organization's overall strategic direction, and the values of your organization. And while I'm here, I'm just going to read you the next paragraph that I left out. In the case of employees, if you know there might be an issue, actually it could be a board member too, if you know there might be an issue around some change that you plan to implement, then identify the informal influencer or the potentially negative person and share with them what you're thinking is behind the proposal you're going to be making and get their perspective in advance of the announcement or meeting. You do not want to be ambushed and have to defend yourself or the plan without preparation. And that applies to board as well as don't go into a board meeting where you know there's a contentious issue without having found your influencers and briefed them on what it's all about so that they can have your back.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any final question or two? You can unmute yourselves and just
Yeah.
like shout out a question. Or a comment.
Well, in the end, we ended on time.
Thank you so
Jane-
much, Jane. This was awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jane,
It was
I
my
want to
pleasure.
thank you so much for doing this for the NBAA. I hope everybody got, something new out of it. I've seen this material before, some of it before, but it's always just a great reminder of what our role is as servant leaders. And we all have leadership moments and we all have following moments. And it kind of helps you to think about both and how we all have to work together to do this. And I do want to give you one final pitch for Jane as a personal coach. She is awesome at that. And it sometimes people think that they only should go to an executive coach if you're an ED, if you're having trouble, but really it's good to just check in at any time, to have that other voice. I was going to put it in the chat. It's better than talking to your spouse about it. Don't bother your spouse every day about what's going on at your place, because they don't really understand what's going on and they're not there in the moment. So I find it, the less that I moan to my husband about it, the more focused I can be about what's really just going on in the workplace.
On,
So
on
the
that
more I
subject,
can enjoy
Emily,
my
cost
home.
is a factor. People
Mm.
do always have a concern, you know, small to medium-sized business. We don't necessarily have the money. I can guarantee you that you will save a lot of money. And I'm sure that if you approach one of your board members who has your back, that they would probably fund it for you.
And you can write it in professional development for some grants
Exactly.
too. You can
Exactly.
consider it that. Well, we need to get off today, but thank you so much for everything. Appreciate you all. We'll post this message. I will send up a follow-up email to people with Jane. If you want to send some stuff to share with this group, that would be great.
Okay,
And
super.
thank you
you so
all
much.
for being here.
Thank you. Bye.